We're now moving on to the next session, which will focus on the collections management and preventive conservation. And to do so, this will be moderated by Mrs. Valerie Magar, who is manager of ICOM's programs unit. So again, before we start, if you want to share any comments or questions in the chat, please do so. And with these words, dear Valerie, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kirsten, and good morning to everyone, and a warm welcome from Rome, where I'm at the moment. So as Kirsten mentioned, I will be moderating this second session, focusing on collections management and preventive conservation. And the session will be divided in two parts. We will first have a speaker, Dr. Trilce Navarrete, whose presentation will be followed by a panel discussion with two panelists, Ms. Marjolaine de Bulpap and Mr. David Tubalem. So we welcome all of them, but we will first start with our speaker. Dr. Trilce Navarrete is a cultural economist at Erasmus University, Rotterdam, where she specializes in the economic and historic aspects of digital heritage. She has contributed to the creation of the European Statistics for Digital Heritage, Enumerate, and has served as advisor for the creation and evaluation of national digital infrastructures. Dr. Navarrete is a board member of the Association of Cultural Economics International, ACI, and secretary of ICOM's International Committee for Documentation, SIDOC. So her presentation will be focusing on protecting by documenting our heritage collections. Welcome, Trilce Navarrete.
Thank you, Valerie, and thank you everybody for UNESCO ICOM for organizing this workshop. I will just get on to it, looking at the time. Let me see that I share this properly. Can Valerie, can you just confirm that you can see the presentation okay? Yes,
everything's okay. Thank you.
Super. So I'll time myself and let's see. So thank you again for this invitation. I will say something about the work of SIDOC and the relationship with protecting our heritage collections. So first of all, SIDOC is the International Committee for Documentation. We are one of 32 international committees. I see we have to update our website. We have a network of about, we have a network of about 920 members from 120 countries. We have in our membership of acting voting members, 713 individuals from 53 countries. We are one of the older international committees in SIDOC. We were funded, we were one of the first ones in ICOM. We were funded in 1950. SIDOC believes that collections without adequate documentation cannot be considered true museums. Why not? Because they cannot care for their objects. They cannot demonstrate legal accountability, and they cannot demonstrate the collection's value. This is from our SIDOC Principles of Documentation from our meeting in Rio in 2013. We are a global community that focuses on advancing documentation. We are professionals working in different fields, some of us in museums, some of us in academia, in policy. And we provide our community with advice about good practice, and together we develop the documentation of museums. We have strong team advancing the development of standards and guidelines to support museum documentation. We currently have 14 working group committees, each one with a specific task. One of the new ones is Domino. is a working group where I'm actually also chairing, in which we focus to translate all of the work of CIDOC specifically for our Ibero-American members and to-be members. And that is because the documentation questions from communities in Ibero-America are a little bit different than from the work of CIDOC in Europe. And just like that, for this, we are running a survey. You might have seen the request to join our survey, in which we are trying to inventory the current state of documentation in museums in Ibero-America. Based on that, we will decide the strategy to best serve our community in those countries. And this is one example of all of the 14 working groups. We have changed this across the years. We have had about 30 working groups that reflect the interest in the times. One of our last working groups being formed is LIDO, which I will talk about in a minute, and linked art, which are also new standards being developed at international level towards documentation. We work closely with Getty, and this facilitates the harmonization of vocabularies and work in general, but I'll say a bit more later. We regularly collaborate with other international committees. I can just name a few which with whom we are currently involved in projects. And one of them is SIMSIM, the International Committee for Musical Instruments. We're working on developing a standard for the documentation of musical instruments. The work of CIDOC focuses on developing standards, and because we believe that having these resources advances the harmonization of our efforts. And perhaps the classic is the CIDOC fact sheets. We started in the 1990s, and the latest one is the recommendations for identity photographs from 2010. We have also developed the international guidelines for museum objective information. This is in relation with object ID from 1995, the CIDOC ICOM, the CIDOC information categories. We have developed the Statement of Principles for Museum Documentation in 2012, the Statement of Linked Data Identifiers for Museum Objects 2012, the Lightweight Information Describing Objects LIDO from 2010, and the CIDOC Conceptual Reference Model, which I should update this slide. The International Standard Organization ISO has been renewed just this last year with a new version, v.4. One of our latest working groups, as I mentioned, is LIDO, the Lightweight Information Describing Objects. It's actually an XML harvesting schema. Its goal is to deliver metadata smartly. That means if a museum has their descriptive information about their objects, they can easily disseminate, reposition this in any multilingual portal supporting this standard. Another working group, perhaps you have heard of this, is quite large, is the CIDOC CRM, Conceptual Reference Model. As its name states, it's actually conceptualization of the knowledge that we have about our cultural heritage, so that it's like a map. Whenever there's a new piece of information, this can be placed within a universe so that anybody would have access to this through semantic technology. It's a little bit more technical, but tremendously functional. If you might think that documentation is too technical, I tell my students the best example of the value of documentation. I believe it just closed, Parisian colleagues. L'Arc de Triomphe was just covered by artist Claude and Cristo. Perhaps they're not themselves, they're both not with us anymore, but their association, their foundation. Why do I use this example for documentation? They have proven that documentation is key to generate value. If you go to their website, their link is below on the left. You will see all of the projects discussed in two sections, the software period and the hardware period. The software period, as they call it, is the time that it takes for them to develop an idea, to work it out through drawings and plans and communication with the local entities in order to get acceptance for doing these massive projects. Then there's the hardware period in which these plans materialize. That is, they gather all of the materials, they cloth l'Arc de Triomphe. This piece is visible for 2 weeks. Generally, their pieces are visible just 2 weeks. Then they take everything down, and that's it. All of this work for just 2 weeks. How does it work? The value is also in these 2 weeks, but fundamentally in the documentation of the process. And in this last work, you see that they started since the 1960s, and when Jean-Claude and Cristo lived in Paris, right nearby, and this is when the conception of the idea came by. I thought it was a relevant example for our producing colleagues. As we have heard earlier, and going back to the topic of our workshop today, the UNESCO Convention from 1970 recently celebrated its 50-year anniversary, is the first legal international instrument for the protection of cultural goods. Countries that have ratified this continuously use it to protect their cultural heritage. I have a colleague that has brought to my attention there are other legislations that are not supportive, to put it somehow. The key is to work together. And my colleague brought to my attention the Freeports for arts, which have worked, for instance, in Switzerland, one of the oldest since 1849. These are places where works of art might be stored without having to pay taxes. And this international tax law allows for these works to not pay value-added tax, transaction tax, or custom duties. The problem with these places is that it's known they can hide works that have been purchased in not the best conditions, if purchased. And one example was highlighted from 2003, where hundreds of antiquities stolen from excavation sites in Egypt were found in the Geneva Freeport. Regarding the illicit traffic, as it has also been mentioned before, this can take place in established physical sites or in online markets. The trouble is on the physical sites, coordinating the efforts when the catalogs are published with such short time in advance, sometimes a week, sometimes 5 days. And countries have to move quickly to check the objects and check the lists. Online, the major challenge is finding these objects, but also changing keywords to commercialize these various products. Regarding illicit traffic, there's a history of travelers and collectors with a very strong commercial interest. We know that archaeological goods are regularly looted, and these rarely have a record or an image. And when it comes to legislation, one must prove that these objects were illicitly acquired. This depends on having evidence of the transaction or of its origin. And this is generally argued through the documentation found on catalogs, on export reports, and any form of documentation and legal reports. In France, I believe there's a good faith of the seller agreement. And to prove the otherwise, then you can also show the Interpol report. This traffic is driven because of the commercial value of the pieces. Objects can be sold for millions. And however, this shows the lack of understanding of the cultural value of the objects. There's a cultural loss due to the restricted access, and sometimes leading to oblivion. Stolen objects lose their context when the provenance is removed, and it's difficult to document them properly afterwards. And this is about documentation about the object, about its history, and about its context. This is the core of the documentation of collections that we at Siddoc try to advance. Sophie has mentioned just earlier object ID. This effort started in the 90s when computers actually started, and these international efforts to inventory collections took national attention. This standard involves 4 steps: taking a photograph of the object, identify basic information, which is listed on the right. This includes the type of object, the materials and techniques, the measurements, the inscriptions and markings for its identification, as well as distinguishing markings and distinguishing features. And if relevant, the title, and the subject, the date or period, and the maker. This is quite basic documentation. And object ID also requires to write a short description and to keep this documentation in a secure place, so that if the entire section is stolen, there is another place where we can find the documentation. Oh, I see my timer. I want to share some of the works that a colleague has done. She specializes on stolen arts, and she has an inventory, the work of Interpol, and particularly using the database of stolen works of art. This uses the object ID with minimal documentation requirements, but her research highlights that policing is done by non-experts. Therefore, this object ID needs to be thought of not only from expert perspective, but from anybody's perspective. On the right, you see a pie that starts on the dark blue. It shows the recovery location of stolen works of art in the same city, followed by orange, and recovery in different city, but in the same region, followed by gray, recovery in different region, but in the same country. That shows that over half of the objects that are recovered within the country. 20% are recovered outside of the country, but in the same continent. And the last light blue, 17% objects are recovered in a different continent. A summary is found on the Economy Store Car website, link is below. And this is my almost last slide. What are the solutions? These have been mentioned before. It's essential that there's coordination between the various organizations and within a country, but certainly among countries. We from Siddoc believe that the increased awareness of the need for protection through documentation is central, particularly following the basic standards for documentation. This is an image from a piece that was returned to Chile once this was found in Germany. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Trilce Navarrete, for this very good overview of Siddox's work within ICOM and the importance of documentation. And we will now go to our two panelists, whom I will now present. We first have Marjolaine de Bulpaap. She holds an MA in art history and archaeology, and she then trained in conservation restoration of paintings and in preventive conservation. Marjolaine is, since 2007, head of the Preventive Conservation Unit at the Royal Institute for Cultural Heritage, KIKIRPA, in Belgium, Brussels. And she offers advice to heritage professionals. She coordinates research projects in preventive conservation and organizes classes, workshops, and national and international seminars. In addition to her leading role in developing a reorg strategy in Belgium, she regularly acts as a trainer for International Reorg Project and is co-author of the forthcoming practical guide, Becoming a Reorg Coach, How to Plan and Lead a Workshop to Implement Storage Reorganization. And she will indeed be focusing now with our questions on storage rooms and the reorganization method and the importance of that part, and complementary to what was mentioned also on storage, on documentation right now. And our second panelist is David Toubalem. After 18 months in the Marines, David Toubalem joined the Service for the Protection of High Personalities after graduating from police school. He then joined the Hermes Group in 1988 as Safety Security Manager for nearly 16 years. And for 6 years, he has been the head of the security department at the National Library of France. He's also vice president of the Agora of Security Directors, and he will be focusing on the means and challenges of securitization of public collections. So we will start with a round of questions for these two panelists. And so my first question will be to Marjolaine. You have learned the reorg method through launching a reorg Belgian strategy and workshop in 2015 in collaboration with ICOM and the Canadian Conservation Institute. And you are now a trainer of ICOM's international reorg courses. So the question is, what exactly is the reorg method, and what have been the most striking lessons learned for you and for the museums you have helped in reorganizing their storage rooms? Thank you, Marjolaine.
Hello, Valerie. Does everybody hear me? Is my sound okay? Okay. Thank you for inviting me, ICOM, UNESCO, and it's nice to talk to all of you. I will show very, very short slides just to introduce you to the reorg method, and then I will answer immediately your question. I will share my screen, and I hope that you can see the first slide. I just want to explain and introduce very, very briefly the reorg method. In fact, it's since 95% of museums objects are kept in storage worldwide, so billions of objects are kept away from public sites. And since the results of an ICOM and UNESCO survey proved that 1 in 4 museums have incomplete documentation systems, 1 in 3 museums are unclear about who is responsible for storage, 1 in 4 museums find it difficult to circulate, and 1 in 2 museums have insufficient storage unit or furniture, ICOM, with the support of UNESCO, developed the reorg method. And the method, which is available online in 7 languages, is a step-by-step approach to help those who work with cultural collections to reorganize their current storage rooms, focusing on the creative use of existing and sometimes or mostly reduced resources. So to answer your question, Valerie, at the time, I realized, I will go back to this. I realized that too little attention was being paid to so many small and medium-sized museums that were struggling and still are struggling with major problems in their storage rooms. And by helping museums here in Belgium and internationally to reorganize their collections using this reorg method, I have seen the enormous impact of a physical reorganization of collections and storage rooms. By physically getting grip on your storage, you can make collections accessible again to staff, to the public, to researchers, to all of us to whom cultural heritage belongs. And the method analyzes and provides solutions related to the management of collections, including access procedures and responsibilities. It looks at the building and its spaces, but also at everything which is needed to keep and store collections safely. Because the collections of museums that have applied Rio become visible, accessible, and so usable again, an update of the documentation system can be made during and after the reorganization. This is my point. Last but not least, because the method puts a lot of emphasis on teamwork and team building, after such a Rio project, you get museum staff who is eager to work in storage and with their collections again. And I see the method as one big capacity building tool. So such a reorganization also ensures that some important causes or risks for collections related to illicit trafficking are counteracted, like not knowing what you exactly have in your storage, no clear visible view of what you have, no clear access procedures, and an incomplete documentation or inventory system.
Thank you very much. I think this shows a very good overview of the combination between documentation and knowing about your collections. So thank you very much. I will now, before I give you your second question, I will give one to David. Alors, pour David, votre parcours professionnel diversifié vous a conduit récemment vers le patrimoine culturel et les collections publiques de la bibliothèque.
David, you recently started working on cultural heritage for the National Library of France. So how is it different from other places? Thank you for inviting me. So this is my presentation. What's different in my museum? So I took my position 6 years ago. I wanted to have an inventory. I came from the Hermès group, and focusing on this heritage, I thought that I could just press on a button and have a full inventory. And yet you have a legal deposit coming every day through trucks. You have a lot of movement and circulation, and it's absolutely impossible to quantify. It's also impossible to quantify what we call traceability. We cannot protect all pages of all works with RFID chips. So we need to know the state of our inventory, and we need to have the legal certainty that the works belong to the National Library of France. So we can do whatever we want. We can use alarms and other means, but we need to do things reasonably. It's a treasury that's not replaceable. We can lodge complaints if we want, but when I see a police officer, it's very difficult to estimate what the prejudice is. You know, with Hermès, for example, you can estimate the loss when a handbag is stolen, but losing a work from Voltaire or someone else, that's very difficult. In terms of fire safety, so I work with the Central Office for Cultural Goods at Interpol. As soon as we see that something has been lost, we report it, but we need to prove that the good belongs to us, that it's our property, which means we need to have a minimum traceability. So securization of cultural heritage is very difficult. When everything's going well, it's okay, but when there's a problem, you can look for a good in many different services, conservation, binding services. You know that there's mercury in ink, so we do a lot of chemical and technical procedures to protect our goods. Now let me move on to the next slide. Thefts are very important. They're a major challenge, but before talking about thefts, we need to talk about securitization. We also have a building in Richelieu. So I started working with medals and collection coins. So I worked with my direction to have reinforced glass windows. That's very expensive. And they said, well, they were in denial. They said that there was no need for that. So you can try to, if you want, you can invest a little bit of money to prevent theft, or you have to pay a lot of money after the good has been stolen. So you need to invest money, and obviously it never happens, but our goal is to prevent it from happening. So you need to have some budget for safety. As you know, people who steal goods analyze things, they audit things, and depending on your level of safety, then they will decide to steal something from you or not. It's never a coincidence. There's prior analysis to a theft, and it's done in a very professional way. So what's difficult to understand with such site is that everything is possible, but you can't wait for something to happen. You have several types of thefts, compulsive thefts. Internally, someone in our building who stole things, people who might tear off pages, and then you have organized theft. So you give money to someone, and the person goes to a museum to steal a painting or a work of art. And it's very difficult to do something with a stolen work of art today. Thank you very much for answering my first question. Now, I have a second question for you. Please be brief because we're running out of time. Question for Marjolijn. What are your recommendations?
No, it's okay. For me, it's okay in French too.
Okay, but how is the Belgian reorg strategy? How did it influence your own work as well as the work of museums who implemented the method? And what would be your advice to other experts in the field? So you can answer in French or English as you wish.
I will try to do a mix. I will start in English. It's incredible, but it's true. But almost all issues regarding preventive conservation of collections, and mainly in storage, then they almost can be solved by all of them by applying the Rio method in a whole or in a part. And learning about and applying the method has helped my advisory role in preventive conservation enormously. And again, I come back with the capacity building and bringing together museums that can help each other through the method. This has created a very large network in Belgium and worldwide. And all those museums, they all know quite exactly now what they have in their storage. And like mentioned by other speakers today, this is one of the many keys against illicit traffic worldwide. And what my advice would be in others experts, or what I'm going to switch over to French parce que je sais plus improviser en français.
It's easier for me to improvise in French. I would like to ask all my colleagues that we shouldn't forget small-sized museums, churches globally that are really struggling today in the museum, but also in the storage rooms. And they don't have enough money. They don't have sufficient means to solve their problems. So I'm not trying to advertise for them, but I think that we should try to help them. Thank you very much. Now, David, a question for you. What would be your recommendations for museums and heritage sites in terms of safety faced with the risk of looting or theft? Well, very simply, regarding churches, for example. The stained glass windows and other objects are stolen from churches. So get out and have a look at your site. What can I do? How can I do it? Is it possible to get out of the church with a work of art? Same thing when you leave your apartment in the morning. So it's a collective problem. When something is stolen from a museum, you feel like it's none of your business because it's not your museum, but it's a common shared heritage. If we don't work collectively, we won't have anything anymore. So everyone should be involved in heritage conservation. In order to analyze a site, you need to look at it from the outside. We don't have enough hindsight to understand what we should do, but we know that it's very easy to penetrate to a museum with a badge. You can go through the delivery access, for example. I have 2 videos, but I don't know if I have enough time so that I can play them. Let me ask Christine if we have time to play the videos, or I think we only have 2 minutes for the videos. It's 30 seconds each. Okay, so we can play them.
Voilà, donc là on est sur le.
So
Voilà, donc vous allez voir la différence entre une vitrine P5B et une vitrine classique. Donc,
you'll see the difference between a P5B glass. So it's very easy to break the glass. So the treasure is now on the floor. So he's not a seasoned thief. He's trying to find the right tools, and he's trying to break the glass for a second time. This is a very prestigious treasure. I will tell you the name and the amount. It hasn't been recovered yet. So it's good to have people inside, security agents to protect a work of art. So luxury watch, for example, for us, we would use adequate protection. Then you'll see something else in broad daylight. Obviously, we always have the worst case scenario in mind when you work in safety. We analyze things differently. How can things be stolen? How can things be done? People in disguise, I have various badges in my bag and can get into any building, for example.
So during opening hours, a citizen is walking in a museum. He simply takes painting, dressed as a painter, and he simply leaves the museum as if he was going to work on the work of art. So things can be very simple. And so I usually try and test and check if I can take those paintings off the wall. They have to be secured, and they cannot simply be that vulnerable. So you need to check what can be done at what time. You have to imagine the worst case scenarios, and without the required expertise, then there's a substantial risk. We live at times whether employees working on works of art of a distant country. Let's give you an example. If I were an Israeli citizen, would I be allowed to work on works of art from Palestine? Those very subtle elements can be essential. What are you going to present? Who will work on the works of art? Who will be in charge of their security? So there needs to be a comprehensive reflection on these works of art. Thank you very much, and thank you to all 3 speakers of this session. I think we have sufficiently discussed the issue of prevention and We had this presentation on the worst case scenarios that have to be taken into account, but also the importance of documentation and, of course, cooperation. So thank you to all three of you.